once you've marked that song in your songbook, I want to just think about something for a moment, and that is, I just can't faith it, or I just can't believe it enough to act upon it. And I want us to think about something. Our what we do, what we say, everything that we believe is based on our faith in the Word of God. It is based on the fact that we believe that Jesus was God in the flesh, that He came to earth, suffered, and died. And sometimes I think that faith is so simple. And yet faith, as we studied this morning in 2 Peter or 1 Peter chapter 2, let's go back there for just a moment. Into our Bible study this morning. I really didn't put our Bible study together with the lesson until we were in it this morning, and I thought about what Peter writes here in 1 Peter chapter 2, and in verse 1. So put away all malice and all deceit, and hypocrisy and envy and slander. Like newborn infants, long for the pure and spiritual milk, that by it you may grow up into salvation. If indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good. What we do is all of these things that Peter is saying, putting away malice, putting away deceit, putting away hypocrisy, putting away envy and slander. We do those things because we believe that Jesus is Lord. And we believe, based on His Word, that that is what He would desire us to do. But the idea that I just can't faith it or can't believe enough in order to change my life is something that is all too common. To begin with, let's think a bit about the subject of blessings this morning. If you were to look at the blessings in your life, I wonder what they would be. And I want you to think about the blessings in your life, and I want you to think about how they became blessings in your life. For some of you, those blessings might look like the person you're married to. Ask yourself, how did that person come into my life? And what had to take place for that blessing to be in my life as a permanent fixture? For some of us, it might also be our children. And I want you to think about that. I know that I take things to the extreme in that department. Not everybody has 10 kids. But when you think about it, which one of my kids would I want to send back? And even if I could pick and choose which kid I wanted, they're all blessings. And so there are certain things, and I think about how those children came into my life and the decisions that have allowed those children into my life. Those decisions are conscious decisions based on what I believe, and the Lord has allowed those blessings into my life. The decisions for me to marry my wife were decisions based upon the faith that I believed certain things, and I believed that there were certain criteria that God set out for a godly wife, and God allowed my wife into my life. So those are decisions for me that have been based on faith. I think if we look around us, though, and see the other blessings in our life, I think that we could clearly see that God has allowed certain blessings into our lives because of our faith. So the question is, how does a person receive a blessing? How do we get blessings? Where do they come from? Do blessings just fall on people randomly? Or is there some force within our lives that allows us to make decisions that bring additional blessings into our lives? I would like for you to entertain the thought that I believe is true and accurate. That if we live our lives in a certain way that God has designed for His people, that we will receive additional blessings in our lives because of that. Well, that would also mean that then faith is involved in those blessings, because we live by faith. The Hebrew writer says we walk by faith and not by sight. If we walk by faith and not by sight, then faith has to some way be involved. When people see a blessing, let me ask you this: have you ever seen a blessing and run the other direction? Give you a little back history. You know, when this congregation started, when Steve and I and Kate and Celia, and we really thought there would be 2 or 3 other families that would be with us. You know, they're like, oh yeah, that's a good idea. You know, or, well, it really would be a wonderful thing. Those other families never actually ever came all the way. And I think about that for a little bit, and I think, they just missed out on a blessing. You know why? Because they missed out on all of you this morning. And getting to know you guys have been a blessing in our lives. But I think about the blessing of everyone who's here this morning, and some are absent this morning from our number because of the snow. But I think about the blessing this congregation has been in our lives and in the lives of my children. And I think about it didn't just randomly happen. There were risks that had to be taken. There were things that had to come into place. They had to be put into place, both physically and mentally put into place for this to take place. So why does all this happen? If faith is involved, and if people sometimes run away from a blessing, why did you run away from a blessing? I want us to delve back into the Old Testament history for a moment, and I want us to turn to the book of Numbers, chapter 13. We'll be getting here in our Wednesday night Bible study before long, so this might be a little bit of a jump ahead of things, but I want us to consider something that happened, a blessing that God wanted to bless His people with, where they ran the other way. The children of Israel have they've been freed from slavery in Egypt. They crossed the Red Sea. Before they crossed the Red Sea, though, God brought about a number of plagues upon the Egyptians that convinced the Egyptians to let them go. But then suddenly Pharaoh and his army said, "What have we done?" And they get on their Land Rovers. Oh, wait a minute. They also called them chariots in that day. They get on their Land Rovers and they're in hot pursuit. They're out after God's people. God's people are up against the Red Sea. They're if you look at a map of where I believe this was located at, it's kind of a bottleneck situation. There's mountains surrounding them. They've just come out of what we would call a canyon. The Egyptians are behind them in the canyon. God opens the Red Sea. God's people cross this sea. The Egyptians begin to follow. And they didn't have four-wheel drive chariots in that day. And they get bogged down in the mud. And God allows the sea to close over top of them into Pharaoh, into army. They travel through the wilderness. They run short on food. God provides them food. They run short on water. God provides them water. So they see all these things. And Moses writes for us as it's happening, and he identifies all of these blessings as the hand of God These are blessings they would not have experienced if they had chosen to stay in Egypt. That brings us to Numbers chapter 13, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the people of Israel." Okay, God is not saying which I'm thinking about giving to the children of Israel. Get that clear in your mind. He says, I am giving it to the children of Israel. From each tribe of their fathers you shall send a man, every one a chief among them. Okay? So God is telling Moses, pick out 12 men. Pick out 12 men. You're to send them into the land of Canaan. They're to look at this land. They're to spy it out. They're to find the benefits. They're to find the weaknesses. They're to find out how we can overcome the land. Now, God knew all of these things. God knew every weak point in the whole land. So why is he wanting people to be sent in? Think about that for a moment. Fast forward down, they're coming back in verse 25. The spies return at the end of 40 days. They return from spying out the land. And they came to Moses and Aaron and to the congregation of the people in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back word to them and all the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. And they told him, we came to the land which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. Besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Anakites dwell in the land of the Negab. The Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites dwell in the hill country, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea along the Jordan. What do we see? Well, realistically, we see a reality. They've seen with their physical eyes fortified cities. They've seen, strongholds. They saw men. The sons of Anak are men of very large stature. Some would say giants by the time there. But Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, "Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it." Well, I want you to consider something. In this passage, we find two different groups of people. We find two different exhibitations of faith. I want you to notice this. The first group, which is the largest, and quite frankly, I'm going to call these guys the can'ts, or can-nots. And I've made an observation in my life that nearly always, not 100% of the time, but nearly always, the can'ts make up the majority. Negative thinkers. Oh, we can't possibly do this. We can't possibly do that. They're almost always in the majority. In this case, it's 10-2. The second group is the cans. I want to reread verse 30. Caleb is the spokesman of the two. He says, "Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it." It's a different opinion, isn't it? This group of people is nearly always in the minority. Not 100%, but nearly always a minority. Why? Both the cans and the can'ts had the same faith. They both of them believed in Jehovah God. Both groups had the same life experience. They had both fled Egypt, all 12 of them. Fled Egypt, all 12 of them experienced the parting of the Red Sea. All 12 of them experienced Pharaoh's destruction. All 12 of them had seen God bring water out of a rock. All 12 of them had seen manna come from heaven. What's the difference? Why is it 10-2? And all 12 of them had the same goal. They left Egypt heading for a promised land which God had promised to give them. A blessing. A land, the Bible says, that flowed with milk and honey. So what is the difference? Let's look at the camps. The larger group, we'll look at them first. The Bible lists them first. Even though they had seen God work in different ways, the camps chose, mind you, I've underlined that in this morning's outline, they chose not to exercise faith in the providence of God. Does that sound familiar? Do we ever choose not to take a chance on faith? I have. This is an attitude that spread like wildfire in Los Angeles. I want you to look at Numbers chapter 14, verse 1. I want you to see this attitude of we can't accomplish this spread from 10 people into millions, thousands at the very least. And all the congregation raised a loud voice, or raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. And all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and against Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, and listen to this, if this isn't a whiny's attitude, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and little ones will become prey. Would it be better for us to go back to Egypt? And they said to one another, let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt. Really? You want to go back into slavery? You've got to be kidding me, folks. But this is the attitude. You see how it began with an attitude, oh, we just can't possibly do this. Into an attitude of despair to the point to where they're ready to go back and say, put the chains on. I'll be your servant again. You really think that's going to happen? You know, when we're looking at things in life and a reason not to trust in God and His ability to see us through a project that is clearly His will, we can always find a reason not to. I mean, seriously. Well, it's just not the right time in my life. Really? I've got to get some things set in order. Well, we could go on and on with legitimate reasons not to do what God tells us to do. Is it really worth it, though? Do we really want to go back into slavery? The Apostle Paul says sin is slavery. If we fail to follow God, that's going back into slavery. Now let's look at the cans. Let's look at those who can overcome. Those who can do what God asks of them. We've got Joshua and Caleb. Again, looking at it from the other direction, Joshua and Caleb went into this land. They went into Canaan. They spied out the land of Canaan. They saw the same fortified cities. They saw the same massive people. They saw the same armies. So if they saw all the same things, what's the difference? Joshua and Caleb made their decisions based not on what they saw physically. They made their decisions based on what God expected of them, what He wanted them, in spite of the obstacles, in spite of the difficulties, in spite of the challenges. They said yes, where the others said no. They said yes, God can do this. They said yes, we are capable. The others said no. You ever say no to something that you know God is wanting out of you? It's easy to do. Isn't Joshua and Caleb, isn't the attitude that they had the very definition of faith? I want you to go back here for a minute. Hebrews chapter 11, before we get into this next slide here, I want to pause. We'll probably look at this a little bit later on, but I want you to look at Hebrews chapter 11. The very definition of faith is taking action without being able to see the outcome. In Hebrews chapter 11 and in verse 1, the Hebrew writer says, now faith is the substance, or the assurance, as the ESV says, of things hoped for. The conviction of things not seen. Caleb and Joshua couldn't see the outcome. They saw the same obstacles, but they made a determination based on their belief in God. And it wasn't blind faith. They knew what God was capable of. They saw the plagues in Egypt. They lived with the frogs. They came through the plague of death. They walked on dry ground through the Red Sea. But so did the other 10. It has been said that the devil is in the details. You've heard that before, I'm sure. Well, I want to argue that point. Satan is not in the details. If you look at how Satan works, Satan is certainly not in the details. Satan tries to gloss over the details. Look with me at Matthew chapter 7 for just a moment. Matthew chapter 7. I want to look at verse 14 of Matthew chapter 7. Actually, let's back up into verse 13. Jesus says, enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the way, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction. And those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. You see, this is exactly what's taking place before our very eyes in our study in the book of Numbers. I want you to go down just a little bit, same chapter, to verse 21. When we're looking at the definition of faith and defining faith, I think Jesus does a fabulous job right here. Jesus says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, There are hundreds of people, thousands of people, I dare say millions of people in the world today who believe in God, who believe in Jesus, and are willing to acknowledge Him as Lord. Verbally. Verbally. But Jesus says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. I ask you, back in our study of the book of Numbers, who is willing to do the will of God in the book of Numbers? God says, I am giving you this land. Who is willing to accept that blessing? Caleb and Joshua. Caleb and Joshua were willing to accept the blessing that God said He would give them. Who is willing to accept the blessing of eternal life? The one who is willing to step out on faith and be obedient to the will of God. In the Gospel of John, chapter 8 and verse 32, it is my belief that to know the truth is what actually frees a person from the bondage of sin. And knowing the truth means knowing the difference between righteousness and sin. Jesus says in John chapter 8, verse 32, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Caleb and Joshua knew the truth. And they were, even though they couldn't see the outcome, even though there were obstacles, they were willing to say, if God is with us, who can be against us? We read a moment ago, Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1, and if we could see in advance, I want you to think about that. Let's go back here again. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. Let me ask you this. If you could see in advance how God's plan was going to unfold in your life, and that there would be no obstacles to overcome, would you really, truly be exercising faith? Would you be believing in something you couldn't see? That wouldn't be faith at all, would it? No, the Hebrew writer says faith is the assurance of things hoped for, but yet he says the conviction of things not seen. And he goes on in verse 3, by faith we understand that the universe, the King James Version will say worlds, was created by the Word of God. So that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. Look at Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6. And without faith it is impossible to please Him, being God. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that He exists, and that He rewards those who, the King James Version will say, diligently seek Him. Who in our study of the book of Numbers chapter 13, which group would be rewarded? Would it be those who want to return to Egypt? Or would it be the minority that says, yes, we're going to come up, we're going to go in, we're going to take over the land? If our study is correct, we have well over 600,000 people, Israelites, traveling in the wilderness. Out of that 600 plus thousand people, how many of them entered into the kingdom? How many of them entered into the land of Canaan? How many survived? See, here's the thing. Because of their unbelief, God said, okay, you don't want to enter that land? You don't have to enter that land. He allowed all but two to die in the wilderness because they wanted to stay there. They wanted to stay right where they were, comfortable, Well, that's debatable. I don't consider sand in my moccasins very comfortable. I don't consider having to get my water out of a rock very comfortable. But they wanted to stay there. And so they decided to do so. And God allowed them to stay there until their death. Now here's the amazing thing. Caleb and Joshua. Caleb and Joshua, God allowed them to live to see the crossing. Joshua is the one who led God's people. Joshua was the one who marched 7 times around Jericho. Those men of faith lived to see the blessing that God bestowed upon them and their descendants. The others never lived to see that blessing. The basic attitude behind many sins, not all, but many sins in our lives, is the sin of selfishness. A selfish attitude coupled with an attitude of self-sufficiency, which is itself the fruit of pride. See, the 10, I'm going to call them the 10 unfaithful spies, the 10 cants, had this attitude of if we can't physically overcome this challenge, it's hopeless. Caleb and Joshua said, we're not relying on ourselves. We're relying on God. Saddens me. I spent time one time in study with a young lady because she couldn't physically overcome sin in her life before becoming a Christian. She never became a Christian. Because she wasn't good enough. The truth is, we're never good enough. We're never going to overcome all that stuff in our lives without Christ. I want to go back to the book of Proverbs and see what the wise man says for just a moment here in Proverbs chapter 16. Proverbs 16 and in verse 18, Solomon says, pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before the fall. When I was looking up that passage last night, I realized there are a lot of passages regarding pride. The idea that pride carries is, I'm capable of this myself. I don't need God. Okay? But the basic attitude behind a lot of sins is, I'm comfortable here. I want to stay where I'm at. I don't want to give up this comfort. You know, when I had my first child, I was all excited. I was going to be a papa. I got a family member saw me at Lowe's 2 days later, and I'm like, Rodney, I can't wait for life to get back to normal. He's like, ha ha! He's like, your life will never be normal again. It's true. Almost 16 years later, my life has never returned to normal. But you know what? I wouldn't want it to return to normal. Normal was boring. Normal was rather empty compared to what I have now. You know, yesterday I came in from splitting wood, and Paul is walking now, kind of this little. And he walks over to me, grabs my leg, and he looks at me. I'm like, okay, I'll pick you up, buddy. Never had that before. 16 years ago. That's right, I'm talking about you. I found a quote that I wanted to share from A.W. Towser's commentary. That quote is, "If we would indeed know God in growing intimacy, we must go this way of renunciation. And if we set upon the pursuit of God, He will sooner or later bring us to this test." What A.W. Towser is saying is, if we truly want to know God in a personal relationship, and we want that relationship, sooner or later, God is going to ask us to give something up in our lives. I don't know what it might be. It might be different for each one of us. But sooner or later, we're going to come to a crossroads where we have to decide, do I want this, or do I want my relationship with God? Sometimes that choice faces us multiple times. Do I want this lifestyle, or do I want to be a child of God? Do I want earthly pleasures, the pleasures of sin, or do I want eternity with Jesus? Sooner or later, we all face that crossroads. And we make a decision based on what is most important to us. And the sad thing is, we can't make a decision for someone else. Each one of us has to make that decision ourselves. Let's again go back into the book of Hebrews. I want you to look for just a moment at just one person mentioned here in Hebrews chapter 11 as being a person of faith. And we've got several parents here this morning. If you're not a parent, it may not mean quite as much to you. But in Hebrews chapter 11, down in verse 17, the Hebrew writer says, "By faith, Abraham, when he was tested," that's at crossroads, "when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, 'Through Isaac shall your offspring be named.' He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back." Abraham had never seen anyone raised from the dead. Abraham didn't even know. He had no evidence that it was even possible to raise someone from the dead. But yet he was willing to follow God's command to give up something that he dearly, dearly loved. Thankfully, God has never asked us to give up our children. But God will ask us all of something. If we love, and it's simply to find out, do we love whatever it is more than we love God? That's the question. And that's the question that we will only be able to answer when we reach that crossroads of life and we have to make a decision. There might be a decision this morning. How much do we love God? Do we want to live in glory? Or do we want to live in sin? Make no mistake, sin is pleasurable. Sin is enjoyable, at least for the moment. But sin ultimately leads us to a separation of God, a severing of our relationship. And there is no more misery than to be separate from God, because He is the source of all blessings, all good things in our lives. Take out your songbook, the songs